Hi, my name is Avery Blankenship. I'm a first-year PhD student in the English department at Northeastern University, as well as a research assistant for the Viral Text Project. And in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the trajectory of early Mark Twain in 19th century American newspapers using the reprint detection methodologies developed by the Viral Text Project. So I'm going to start by just sort of briefly going over the general methodology behind the Viral Text Project, as well as unpacking a term that we like to use, which is speculative bibliography. So, of course, you can read more about the work that we do on our website. It's viraltext.org. But for the sake of this talk, I'm going to start by showing you this image. It's from Harper's Weekly. It's the January 17, 1874 edition. And we like to show this image when we talk about our methodologies because it really encapsulates sort of the heart of what we're really working with here when we talk about 19th century reprinting. This image shows sort of the print shop. You've got the newspaper editor standing at his table, but interestingly enough, in the background, you see this sort of selection of newspaper articles that he's cut out with a pair of scissors. And really, this encapsulates a lot of how reprinting was working in 19th century American periodicals, which is that newspaper editors were quite literally cutting and pasting material from one another and sort of borrowing and adapting material. And so really, by being able to trace sort of the trajectory of some of these individual articles, we can sort of pick up on really interesting trends in the way that information is being moved and adapted in the 19th century. Generally, in the 19th century, there was a very loose understanding of copyright and intellectual property. And so there wasn't really the same level of consequence for adapting and borrowing material as we like to think of today. The Viral Text Project generally utilizes techniques from natural language processing and computational linguistics to make textual comparisons across the Chronicling America corpus of digitized 19th century newspapers. And so using a sort of distant reading approach, we can sort of take this mass of text from Chronicling America, very messy because it's OCR'd by computers, and sort of compare similarities across texts. And so what we're able to do is use an index of 5 grams, which is a window that is 5 words long, and sort of slide that window across the text in order to find places where it matches. And so by using this sort of distant reading approach, we're able to pull text together that show up in multiple newspapers and develop what we like to call a speculative bibliography, or an idea of what might be getting reprinted and adapted in a sort of text network that is otherwise super unwieldy. And so the results of this data is a supermassive spreadsheet that is super intimidating, but tells us a lot of really cool information about the ways that texts are being changed and adapted as they travel across the United States in this period. Because the algorithm doesn't privilege specific authors or titles, we're able to surface some of the 19th century texts which were frequently reprinted but lack the sort of paratextual data that would make indexing them really difficult using more traditional methods. And recently, the Viral Text Project has also introduced the Wright American Fiction collection of nearly 3,000 digitized works of American fiction to the data in order to more accurately pinpoint the circulation of specifically fiction in the newspaper. And so that collection is freely available online. It's super easy to navigate. You can sort of toggle between text, images, the entire document, as well as XML, which is really useful for computational analysis. But interestingly, the Wright collection covers the years 1851 to 1875, which in the case of Twain is sort of the beginning of his career, which makes it a really interesting case study for thinking about how Twain is sort of wrestling with this idea of authorship and circulation in the 19th century. And as scholar Tracy Worcester says, focusing on the development of Mark Twain's reputation requires shifting from strict literary questions to questions about the relationship between literary production and the marketplace, which is why focusing on the newspaper is a really interesting case study for Mark Twain, because you can see how he's working through this idea of what it means to be a traditional author versus a newspaper writer. So although Twain was just at the beginning of his writing career in the years 1851 to 1875, he's still the 8th most reprinted author in the Wright collection, even with the absence of some of his most well-remembered works like The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. However, taking a closer look at some of the most reprinted texts associated with Mark Twain, we can see that many of them were not actually written by Twain, but were compiled by him in his 1873 collection, A Book for an Hour, which contains a combination of short sketches written by Twain and humorous sketches pulled from the newspaper, which he's adapted and edited. This again sort of reflects this idea that in the 19th century, authorship was really an expanded concept. And so when we think of authors in the 19th century, we're thinking of author as someone who wrote something, but also author as somebody who has edited it or somebody who's collected it and just compiled it into a book publication. The combination of these distinct types of texts, all in the same publication, can make distinguishing between the two pretty muddy. But in this talk, I'm going to attempt to try and do some of that work to sort of push at these questions of what it means to Twain at this period to be an author. And so my first point I'd like to focus on is this idea of Twain's relationship to authorship, and how by looking at the ways in which some of these pieces that he represents are circulating in the newspaper, we can really start to understand how he is thinking of himself as author. And this is just an interesting quote from his Sketches New and Old. It's an 1875 collection. In the preface, he writes, "I have scattered through this volume a mass of matter which has never been in print before. Not doing this in order to make an advertisement of it, but because these things seem instructive." And so this is an interesting quote, because what it really shows is that by declaring that there are things in this book publication that have never been in print before, not only does this assert his authority over those pieces, but it also retroactively claims authorship of everything else in that collection that has been in print before. And so this sort of encapsulates this idea that in the 19th century, writers were really wrestling again with an expanded notion of authorship, and they were sort of trying to at the same time benefit from this system as they were struggling against it. And so in this instance, Twain is really trying to push back against this idea that author is editor or author is collector, even though in his earlier work he is also participating in this same system. So I want to draw your attention to a sketch which Twain declares he has written, called A Self-Made Man. And this is from his anthology collection, A Book for an Hour. As you can see clearly in the book publication of this sketch, Twain is claiming authorship by placing his name directly under the title. He doesn't do this for some other pieces that are included in this book publication, which evidences that he actually wrote this. However, the same sketch also appears in newspapers in different forms. So, for example, here is the same sketch from the Portland Daily Press in Maine, and it's under the title McFadden's Masterstroke rather than the title A Self-Made Man. Here you have it again in the Stark County Democrat. It's under a different title, again, Making a Fortune, with this sort of tagline, the modern way to wealth, operating in bank stock, perseverance, and nitroglycerin rewarded. It is actually attributed to Mark Twain, but only at the very end of the article. And then you have it again showing up in the Cecil Whig in Elkington, Maryland, and it's under the title Making a Fortune, this time with Twain's attribution at the bottom. And so this is sort of a mix-up of Twain's own authorial attribution and then this title that Twain hasn't actually given the article. And then you have another iteration from the Chicago Daily Tribune. It's How Mr. McFadden Grew Rich. And this time there's no attribution to Twain at all. So from these examples, it's clear that the short sketches that Twain primarily produced in his early career are precisely the kind of text that travels very quickly through the newspaper and is easily modified to suit the needs of a newspaper editor. In these examples, you can see that the title is not sort of key to the text, and neither is authorial attribution. And so in these examples, you can really see that the newspaper editor is able to sort of move the author and the title at will, with very little say from the writer themselves. Here is another example, this time a sketch not written by Twain. It appears in his odds and ends section in A Book for an Hour. And here you're seeing Twain show himself more as a compiler and as an editor rather than as an overt author. And so this sketch comes from the Danbury News, and he titles it Persuading a Hen. We have evidence of the same sketch showing up in another book publication in 1873 by the writer James Bailey. He was known as the Danbury Newsman. And so it's more likely that James Bailey, at the very least, was the first to collect this piece, if not the one to write it. And James Bailey titles this piece Driving a Hen. You have same situation, a article that it seems that Twain has edited or adapted for his odds and ends section of A Book for an Hour. This sketch is also being pulled from the Danbury News, and he titles it Sewing Buttons. Though again, in Life in Danbury, we can see that the title that James Bailey attributes to this piece is called A Button Off. And so really what you're seeing here is that at the same time that Twain is trying to assert his authorial control over the pieces that he writes, he's also participating in this culture of reprinting. He is participating in the collecting, the adaptation, the editing, and he's putting his name on it, even if he still attributes it to the Danbury Newsman by compiling all of these different articles, putting them in a book, and then stamping his name on it. He is, in a way, exerting some level of authorship over these pieces, even if he does acknowledge that they're coming from places like the Danbury News. And here you've got the same sort of articles. They're showing up in newspapers as well, again, attributed to the Danbury News, though this time with Twain's title rather than the title that Bailey gives the piece. This is in Donaldsonville, Louisiana. And all of this sort of points us to my second point, which is this idea that Twain in circulation looks different than Twain, the way that we're used to thinking of him in book publication form. So Twain, the version of Twain that we're used to thinking of is Twain in that sort of white suit, sort of an established writer. He's in control of his name and his brand. But what these examples sort of illustrate about Twain is that there was, at least in his early career, a little less control over the ways in which these pieces are circulating in the newspaper. And so I'm going to sort of hone in on a couple of key examples of Twain's in circulation to show that not only is Twain not as in control of his brand and his name in his sort of early career, but that depending on what newspapers people are reading and where they live in the country, they're actually getting really different versions of Twain, if they're getting him at all. And so I want to sort of just point out this quote from Richard Broadhead, and it really sort of encapsulates this idea of Twain in circulation when he writes that a work of writing comes to its particular form of existence in interaction with the network of relations that surround it. In any actual instance, writing orients itself in or against some understanding of what writing is, does, and is good for that is culturally composed and derived. And so really we're thinking about writing as something that is very situated in wherever sort of region of the United States it's taking place and where it's being adapted. And that's something that Twain has very little say over. So I want to start by pointing us to this example from Mark Twain's sketches, New and Old. It's a sketch that he titles The Judge's Spirited Woman. And we know that this is something that Twain has actually written, given the preface to the collection, and that most of the works in this collection are evidence to be actually written by Twain himself. When you see the same work in the New York Sun, it's actually just titled A Murder Trial, and it's attributed to The Galaxy, a magazine that Twain contributed to often. There actually isn't any attribution given to Twain himself in this iteration. You see it again in the Anderson Courthouse in South Carolina. Again, Twain is given no attribution. It's just attributed to The Galaxy. Again, with that title, A Murder Trial in Nevada. When it shows up in the Chicago Tribune, it's titled under some of Mark Twain's latest stories, and then this time with the correct title, The Judge's Spirited Woman, and then again attributed to The Galaxy in that byline. And then in another iteration in Fayetteville, Tennessee, you see that, again, it's under that title, A Murder Trial in Nevada. It's attributed to The Galaxy. It is attributed to Mark Twain, but it does have this sort of extra information. It says, it must have been Senator Nye of Nevada, from whom Mark Twain in The Galaxy of this month got the following story of life in Nevada. And so this is an interesting case study because it shows you that the newspaper editor in this situation has given this little bit of extra information that Mark Twain himself did not actually provide. And so what is happening in this situation is that not only is the trial associated with Nevada, but it's also specifically affiliated with Senator Nye. And so that lends it sort of an air of reality that perhaps the original iteration of the sketch might not have had. And even in this sort of minor example, you can see that the reader of this newspaper is getting a slightly different version of the sketch than somebody who is reading a version titled The Judge's Spirited Woman. Here we've got it again, the murder trial in Nevada. This is in Jasper, Indiana. And this time there's no attribution to Twain, and there's actually no attribution to The Galaxy either. And so when this article is presented to a reader, there is that sort of association with Nevada, but it's not understood to be Twain, and it's not understood to be coming from The Galaxy either. And so a reader who is seeing this might not know that they're actually reading Twain at all. They might just think that they're reading just some work that is being contributed to the newspaper by some writer, and they would not even consider this to be part of sort of the patchwork of Twain's early works. A second example appears in Mark Twain's A Book for an Hour in his odds and ends section called Court Decorum in Nevada. And this piece is a really interesting case study because even though Twain did not write this piece, his edited version of it is what actually has some pretty interesting trajectory in the newspaper. So when it first starts to circulate, it's circulating in Iowa, and it is just in the humor section with no title. The sort of first little bit of information that we have is this bit that reads, "What a great institution courts must have been in the West. When the aegis of the law was first extended over that poker and whiskey-loving region. Among the many good things told in that connection, the following from the New York Sunday Dispatch may well take precedence." And so again, it's sort of providing this paratextual information that tells us, okay, this is a funny story about court life in the West, and this time West is this sort of broad category. When it shows up again in Richmond, Virginia in the Daily Dispatch, it's this time under the title Western Court Etiquette. So again, it's being attributed to the West as sort of an entity, but it's lost a little bit of that paratextual information that the earlier publication of the text does have. When it shows up this time in the Weekly Portage Sentinel in Ohio, rather than being attributed to the West, this time it's just titled Court Incidents. And so it's lost that sort of regional specification that we see in the earlier iterations of the article. This is actually pretty common for 19th century humor, that as the pieces are sort of circulating in the newspaper, they're getting a sort of regional spin put on them. And so in this case, this is a humorous piece that's poking fun at the lack of decorum in Western courts. And so when the piece shows up in the West, there's this sort of move by newspaper editors to push the association off of their own regions and onto some other region. Similarly, when we see the piece circulating in international papers, it tends to be titled American Court Incidents rather than Western or even Court in Nevada. And so that puts the sort of lack of decorum on America as an entire entity rather than the West. When it shows up again in Ohio, a little bit later on, we get this addition to the text, which is that, so in the original sketch, the lawyer is arguing with the judge, and in order to prove his point, the lawyer asked to show a book. This time, the book is actually given a specific title. It says that it's a volume of Blackstone, which is a British text that's often used in talks about the Constitution. So this is, again, adding that level of specificity that lends it an air of reality. And then interestingly, when it shows up in Iowa, again, you've got this paragraph that's actually tagged on to the end of the article that, again, is lending it this air of reality at the same time that it's pushing this lack of decorum away from the West and onto a specific state. So in this paragraph, it reads that for the last 20 years, basically this newspaper article has been circulating around, but this citizen from Galveston, Texas, can tell us that this is actually referencing a real court case that actually did happen, and it was in Missouri. And so by adding this little paragraph to the end of the sketch, rather than being associated with the entity of the West, this now becomes a real court case that actually happened in 1835 in Missouri, rather than just a humorous little tidbit that somebody has written up for the newspaper. And what's interesting, though, is that it's not until Twain actually publishes his edited version of the sketch that it becomes affiliated with Nevada specifically. So once Twain publishes a book for an hour and he titles the piece Court Decorum in Nevada, that's when we actually see that the regionalism that's being associated with the piece and that sort of Western entity, or even Missouri or Texas or America as a whole, becomes specified to Nevada. In this iteration of the article, we can see that there are these little details that have been added to, again, lend it that air of reality. For instance, it says, in the early days of Nevada, judging from a scene which occurred in one of the lively little towns in that region, related to us by one of the pillars of the Nevada bar. So there's this little bit of information that, again, makes it seem like something still funny, but that might have actually happened. And so what really is happening here is that we're getting Twain as an editor, and the ability for editorial control to actually influence the trajectory of the text. And so even though Twain didn't write that sketch, because the version that has the most veracity in the newspaper in sort of the tail end of its lifespan is Twain's edited version, readers are actually getting Twain without even knowing that they're getting Twain. So even though that sketch in the newspaper is never actually associated with Twain, because we know that Twain is the one who puts that stamp of Nevada on it, suddenly that's the version that actually becomes the most authoritative in the newspaper. So I'm going to turn this time to a sketch that we know is written by Twain. Again, it's because this sketch is about Twain's early writing career as a newspaper editor or as a newspaper journalist. And it shows up in two collections of Twain's in the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. It also shows up in his Mark Twain sketches, New and Old. And in this sketch, which Twain titles an item which the editor himself could not understand, essentially what's happening is Twain gets a report from a friend about some horrendous accident that has happened, and Twain, in his hurry to publish it in the newspaper, stops the presses, adds the article to the next day's sort of round of publications, and then only then realizes that the report of the accident doesn't make any sense. So then his editor finds out that he stopped the presses to publish this sort of chaotic account and is, of course, very upset. And it's so funny, haha. Well, when this same sketch circulates in the newspaper, interestingly, that sort of paratextual information, which includes the punchline, is actually taken away from the article. So instead of being titled, again, an item which the editor himself could not understand, and sort of providing this extra information, for instance, that this is taking place in Virginia City, that this is Twain as a newspaper journalist, all of this sort of information is gone. And instead what we're getting is this middle section, which is just the report of the accident itself. And so rather than this being sort of like a meta report of Twain reporting on his reporting, we just get the report. And so this is interesting because, again, it sort of takes the context of the punchline away. And so we just get the actual chaotic report. And so whereas his later sort of iteration of the sketch is, again, that sort of meta reflection, here we can just see how the sketch that he's actually referring to is being reproduced and reprinted in the United States before he can even write the sketch about it. And when it shows up then in Cairo, Illinois in 1871, again, it's primarily just the accident report, but this time it has this little interesting paragraph at the top. So at the top it reads, Mark Twain in the Galaxy for October gives the following narrative of a distressing accident, and it must be confessed a very slight burlesque on the style of some local reporters. This is pretty crucial information that the newspaper editor has included here, because by telling us that this appeared in the Galaxy, which is a well-known sort of humorous magazine, the reader is then primed to understand, okay, this is a humorous sort of accident report. And even if they don't get to the punchline, which is the newspaper editor finding out that Mark Twain has halted the press to publish this report that makes no sense, they are still primed to understand this as something that is funny and probably fictitious. Again, this little information, this little bit that's added to the end, that it's a slight burlesque on the style of some local reporters, is pretty crucial too, because again, that's lending it that air of reality that the other iterations of the sketch just didn't have. And so in this iteration, this idea that this is in the style of local reporters then makes the context of this sketch relevant to people reading it in Cairo, Illinois, rather than in Virginia City, Nevada, where it originally was published. When it shows up in the New York Sun in 1876, it's under the title, A Frightful Accident in Boston, reported by Mr. Mark Twain. Here, it's a very different setup for the sketch. We are, again, just getting the accident report, but it's lost that sort of spin of humor. So even though the report itself is very nonsensical, and we could assume anybody knowing that they're reading Mark Twain is going to come into it assuming that it's going to be humorous, because it has that title, A Frightful Accident in Boston, and because it's sort of presented as is, the reader is really left to sort of do with it what they will. So there might have been some folks who read this and understood that this is a humorous piece written by Mark Twain, but because it doesn't have that key paratextual data, like it was published in the Galaxy, that, you know, the punchline is there, all of that information is pulled out of the accident report. And so it really is just a representation of a more serious iteration of this accident report. This time, instead of being attributed to Nevada, where Twain himself says that he wrote this piece, it's actually being attributed to Boston, which is pushing it away from the West and into the Northeast. When it shows up in 1892 in South Dakota, this time it's under the title Mark Twain's Scoop. This time it does have this little bit of paratextual information that again sort of situates the reader in how they're supposed to read this text. And so this time it reads, "Here is another story of Mark Twain. When he got his first position as a sub-editor on a California paper, his cronies used to swell his record by giving him exclusive news. One night, a friend brought in an account of a fatal smash-up, and Mark, tickled with the scoop, sent it up without reading it. Here it is as it appeared in the paper." So in this situation, the sketch this time is being attributed to California rather than Nevada. And again, you're getting the accident report, but the ways in which the sketch is framed primes the reader in a slightly different way. So it's pushing all of the humor onto Mark Twain and his haste rather than sort of a nonsensical report. Interestingly, this piece also adds on a little paragraph at the end that reads, "All that day, the people read that item, scratched their heads and wondered what happened to good Mr. Schuyler. The chief editor," and this is the same editor that's referred to in Mark Twain's original version of the sketch, "the chief editor kicked the furniture and swore, and Mark took to the woods." And so this is a unique paragraph that only shows up in this iteration of the sketch. But again, in presenting this, it sort of resituates the reader around what is really happening in this sketch. And so in this instance, Mark Twain runs away into the woods, which is something that doesn't happen in any other version of the sketch, including the version that Twain himself publishes in 2 of his collections. And so the version of Twain that people in South Dakota are getting in the 1892 version of the Turner County Herald is a version in which a newspaper chief can throw furniture at him and he will run away into the woods. And then, as you can see, you know, Twain has very little control over his brand when it can be sort of transmutated and modified and adapted in a way that he has little knowledge of. The paper being published in South Dakota, Twain has probably had no idea that this was even published in South Dakota. And so there's no way for him to sort of retroactively state, hey, I didn't actually write that. And interestingly enough, the sketch has other sort of iterations that are a little bit more serious. So in this version of the same sketch in 1890 in Kentucky from the Big Sandy News, this time there's this little bit, again, of paratextual information that's added to the top of the sketch. So it reads, "Accidents, it is said, will happen in the best regulated families, and so they do. It is one thing to see an accident. It is quite another to describe it. Just for pastime, dear reader, try writing up in graphic pharisology some accident that may have chanced to come under your observation. Several years ago, a young Boston fellow was detailed to write the account of an assault that was made on a businessman of that city one evening. After wrestling for several hours with the subject, he submitted the following." So in this situation, the sketch is not being attributed to Mark Twain at all. And this time it isn't affiliated with Virginia City. It's not affiliated with the West. It's pushed out onto Boston. And instead of this being an account that was provided to Twain by his friend, it's framed more as a serious journalist has attempted to truthfully sort of convey this distressing accident, and they were just a poor writer, which we know Twain was not. And so this sort of fictitious version of Twain seems to be almost the antithesis of how Twain himself frames the very same piece in his own publications. And again, this is showing up in Kentucky in 1890. And so there's little sort of chance for Mark Twain to then retroactively go back and say, hey, I didn't write this in Boston, and actually I am an experienced writer, and also this is a report that I got from my friend. And so a reader sort of picking this up in the Big Sandy News, A, has no idea that they're getting Mark Twain at all. They don't know that this is written by Twain. And B, the way that this sketch is framed is sort of a little bit more serious, and it's poking fun at something slightly different. So instead of the accident itself being sort of funny because it doesn't make sense, what's being sort of made fun of in this situation is the inexperience of the journalist. And the final example I'll show of this sort of really interesting piece that circulates in the newspaper, as you can see quite a bit, is another iteration of the same sketch, this time in 1873 in Rutland, Vermont. And what's interesting about this version of the sketch is that it's actually embedded within something that you wouldn't expect to find it in. So this is an article sort of advocating for the purchasing of gas works for a town to sort of light the streets. And it is a serious article. It is not meant to be humorous. And what's interesting in this case is that the report, the distressing accident, is actually embedded within this sort of larger argument for buying gasworks to light the streets. And so again, you've got this sort of like serious buildup, and then all of a sudden we see sort of embedded in the middle of this article is our familiar nonsensical report written by Twain. And what's interesting is that this time it actually is attributed to Twain, but the way in which it's attributed is, again, putting that more serious spin on it. And so at the end of this sort of report of the accident, it's attributed to Twain on the streets of San Francisco. Again, not Virginia City, like Twain himself claims it was written. The accident report has also been edited, so it's a little bit more reflectant of the grief of this mother character rather than sort of pushing into the humor. It still makes very little sense, but the way in which this article is sort of picking it up is trying to recontextualize it to make it seem more serious, to frame it as an actual argument for lighting the streets. Interestingly, the article ends with this little sentence at the end that says, the district court found for the plaintiff in this decision was unanimously affirmed by the Supreme Court. And so in this case, this sort of humorous, distressing accident has now become evidence for a court case in the Supreme Court. And so, as you can see, the newspaper editors and the readers are sort of taking up Twain and deploying him in ways that suit their needs and suit the needs of their readerships. And so again, this version of Twain that we're used to thinking about is, you know, the white suit Twain who is in control of his brand and in control of his name. It's just not applicable to sort of early Twain's career, where there's very little control over how his writing is being deployed by newspapers, how it's being taken up, how it's being adapted. And so the versions of Twain that people are getting at different parts of the country can actually look quite different from one another, which differs quite a bit from how we're used to thinking about that branded image. And so really what I'm wanting to do now is to just sort of reiterate some of the points that I've made in this talk. There are plenty of other examples of Twain being sort of used in similar ways in the newspaper that is, again, reflectant of this sort of lack of control over the sort of information flow in the 19th century, but it's also very reflectant of a more expanded notion of authorship than perhaps we're used to thinking of today. Again, this is a notion of authorship that includes author as editor and author as compiler and author as a name that just gets added by a newspaper editor or a name that is taken away by a newspaper editor. And so, you know, in some of these examples that I've shown, you can see how Twain really was pushing back against this idea of expanded authorship by including some of these key details in his sketches. So he includes details such as, you know, my name is Mark Twain. I wrote this in Virginia City. This happened in Nevada. But you can see that even that sort of crucial paratextual information is so easily removed by the newspaper editor or spun in a completely different context. So something that Twain says he wrote in Nevada is very easily taken and reprinted as something that he wrote in San Francisco, or something that he wrote in Boston, or something that he didn't write at all. But at the very same time that sort of this system is working for and against Twain, Twain is also participating in it. So Twain is taking information from the newspaper and he's adapting and he is editing it. And in some cases, that is actually the version of the text that has the most veracity in the newspaper rather than the original version of that sketch. So in this case, I'm thinking back to that example of court decorum in Nevada, where originally, the sketch was just attributed to the West as a general entity, but once Twain declares that this is something that has occurred in Nevada, suddenly that becomes the authoritative version of the text. And so the ways in which these relationships are working in the 19th century in periodical publications is very much reciprocal. So Twain, like many authors, is writing material for the newspaper, but he's also pulling material from the newspaper. And so there's a lot of sort of back and forth that's happening where the newspaper exchange is sort of pushing information into the country at the same time that authors are taking it from the newspaper for their own purposes and for book publication. So he's thinking about both things at the same time. Twain as, again, editor, collector, newspaper writer, and also Twain as somebody who might take this information and then publish it in a book, put his name on it, and in that way declare authorship. And so this work in general points to this idea that when we're talking about the early careers of these more established writers and even sort of mid and later careers of these same writers, when you're speaking about their works in the context of the newspaper, you have to think about the ways in which readers and editors are interacting with these pieces in a way that's different. And so the relationship is less Twain speaking directly to a reader through a book and more Twain being mediated and repurposed by newspaper editors for their readers. And then readers are taking up this work in ways that may not even reflect the original intention of the author at all. If you're interested in this sort of work and the larger conversations that we have at the Viral Text Project around fiction circulation, as well as the circulation of other types of texts in 19th century newspapers, we do have a book coming out, hopefully soon, called Going the Rounds. We do have 2 draft chapters up online, and we hope to have another draft chapter up that goes into more detail on the specifics of the Wright experiment pretty soon, so be looking out for that. I also do have a website. I have a Twitter account, but I don't check it super regularly. But if you want to get in contact with me, this is a good place to check. It's averyblankenship.com. I try to post little blog entries as often as I can, so please get in contact with me there. And I would just like to take this second to thank my wonderful supervisors, Ryan Cordell and David Smith, as well as all of the project alumni and research assistants who have really contributed to the work of the Viral Text Project and sort of allowing me to really stand up on my soapbox and talk about Mark Twain in the newspaper. So thank you very much for making it to this point in my talk. I am very willing to answer any questions or to talk more about Twain in the newspaper. Like I said earlier, there are numerous examples of the similar ways that Twain is sort of being taken up in the newspaper. And unfortunately, I had to sort of pick the best ones for this talk. But if you're wanting to hear more, just drop me a line and I am very open and willing to talk about what this sort of work looks like. So thank you very, very much for your time. And I look forward to speaking with you about Twain.